Anyone who had Jamar Chase or went against him last week knows exactly how much difference one player can make in fantasy. Let's see who can go off for a huge game in Week 11. Before we set those fantasy lineups, let's set those picks on Underdog. You can still do NFL pick'ems at any time during the week, and if you haven't tried Underdog yet, let's start you out with a freebie. Jalen Hurts just going higher than 0.5 total yards on Thursday night. That's a free pick that you get. You get that free pick plus a deposit match all the way up to $1,000 worth of bonus cash on your first deposit if you use code ENDGAME when you check out as a new customer. All right, we're going to start off with a pair of receivers who've been, well, either boom or bust, but it sounds like they might boom this week.
Yes, I think if you ask most fantasy players who the most frustrating player or to have on your team this year is, they probably would say Zay Flowers, because he either absolutely goes off or he does absolutely nothing. And it's not just that it feels that way, it's actually true. In half of his games this year, he's had at least 91 yards or over 100 receiving yards. In the other half, he's never even reached 40 yards. He is truly the definition of boom bust this year. But I think this is the week he's going to absolutely boom. I know you say, as Steelers, good defense. How could Zay Flowers boom here? But this is actually a great matchup for Zay Flowers specifically. When you look at him, man versus zone coverage. Against man coverage, 2.51 yards per route run. That's pretty good. But against zone, that number goes all the way up to 4.13 yards per route run. The Steelers play zone over 70% of the time. They're hardly ever in man coverage. But also, the Steelers lead the entire NFL in cover 3 alignment. They're in cover 3 almost half the time, more than any other team. And against cover 3, he averages 5.5 yards per route run. He's one of the best wide receivers statistically against cover 3. So even though on paper it's like the Steelers, tough matchup, I think this is a great spot for Zay Flowers this week. And this is the kind of guy you never want to keep out of your lineup because the upside is so massive every single week. I know it's always a little terrifying to put him in your lineup because at the same time you're worried he might bust. But this week he's going to boom. Make sure you start Zay Flowers. And even if you don't have Zay Flowers, or maybe you're too scared to start Zay Flowers for some reason, at least go take his line on Underdog higher than 58.5 receiving yards. He can do that even if he doesn't have the biggest of games this week. You pair that with that Jalen Hurts new customer special. That's an easy win right there. Just make sure you join using promo code ENDGAME to take advantage of that new pick and up to $1,000 in bonus cash.
Well, Flowers has been frustrating. That's because he took up the mantle from George Pickens, who had been the most boom-bust player of all. That is until Russell Wilson came along. The last 3 games since Russ has become the quarterback there, George Pickens has not gone under 74 yards in a game. He scored in 2 of those 3 games, and this week should absolutely be his best week because he gets the defense that Jamar Chase just humiliated. George Pickens is making the most of every one of his targets. Since Russ took over, George Pickens is 5th in yards per target at 13.8. So George Pickens is getting chunks of yardage here, and Baltimore, of course, gives up chunks of yards, the most touchdowns, the most fantasy points per game, the most everything. And although Jamar Chase did a lot of damage to their statistical standing here, even if you take Chase both of his big games away against the Ravens, they've given up 6 games of 20-plus fantasy points to 6 other receivers. This Ravens defense is going to give it up to somebody. Who is it going to be in Pittsburgh? It's going to be George Pickens because, again, there's still not much target competition there, and Pickens is finally coming to his own as, dare I say, an elite fantasy receiver. By the way, if you feel like this video is helping you set your lineup for Week 11, help us out, hit the like button, and subscribe if you haven't yet. All right, now let's talk about some running backs who could go off.
I think this is the week we finally see Jahmyr Gibbs absolutely go off. It's been a weird season for Jahmyr Gibbs. Like, he's been good in fantasy, but he hasn't had those huge games yet. But I think this is the week because they're playing the Jacksonville Jaguars. Now, it's not just because the Jaguars are bottom 5 in terms of fantasy points allowed to running backs. They are, and that's a plus. But really, what's weird here is the Jaguars aren't really that bad against the run. I mean, they're allowing less than 100 yards per game to running backs, less than a touchdown per game to running backs. But they're terrible stopping pass-catching running backs. They're allowing almost 6 receptions per game to running backs, which is the 4th most in the NFL, and they're allowing the 4th most receiving yards to running backs. And it's weird that Jahmyr Gibbs somehow at this point in the season only has 22 catches, but he's still the preferred pass-catching back here. When you look at him versus David Montgomery, he's run a route on 43% of dropbacks. David Montgomery only on 23% of dropbacks. So if either running back is going to take advantage of the Jaguars' weakness against pass catching running backs, it's going to be Jahmyr Gibbs. Not to mention that this is a defense that gives up the 6th most explosive runs in the entire NFL, and Jahmyr Gibbs leads all qualified running backs in explosive runs this year. This is a great spot for Jahmyr Gibbs against this hapless Jacksonville defense. And what I really like, I feel like the last few weeks, the Lions have been leaning on Jahmyr Gibbs a little bit more than David Montgomery, especially late in games, especially in crunch time. So I think this is the week we finally see that huge Jahmyr Gibbs game.
All right, this might sound like odd advice, but I have a player that if you got him, you probably should try to trade him. But if you don't, or you can't, you should definitely start him. And I'm talking about Kareem Hunt. So first of all, you might know Isaiah Pacheco has been tabbed to return from IR after missing several weeks, but he's not going to play in week 11, right? That's not going to happen. Maybe next week, we'll see. This is a good time before your league's trade deadline to try to get something out of Hunt before he starts to lose a lot of carries, if not all of his fantasy value. But this week, it's still all Kareem Hunt because that's what it's been throughout this middle portion of the season with Pacheco out. He's averaging almost 21 carries per game in the 6 games that he's played, and he has been productive. He scored 5 touchdowns. He actually has a great spot this week because even though Buffalo is a tough team, it's not against the run. In fact, it's kind of shocking how much of a run funnel defense this has become and how bad they've been against running backs. Only the Carolina Panthers have given up more fantasy points to running backs than Buffalo. Shocking, right? Now, Kareem Hunt isn't really being what you would call efficient as a runner, 3.6 yards per carry. It really doesn't matter when you get the ball 20 times a game. It's just logical that Kansas City is going to try to attack Buffalo by running the ball first because that's how you beat this defense. They have a really good pass defense, and sure, they got Pat Mahomes, but this pass offense is not what it used to be. So I feel like a big workload coming in store for Hunt. It's a good matchup. Why not extract everything you can out of Hunt before he gets back to hitting the bench behind Pacheco? Let's look a little further down the roster here. These are some flex options that might have huge upside in week 11.
I think Courtland Sutton has huge upside this week. Apologies to Courtland Sutton last week. I doubted you against the Chiefs. You came through, and he's really been coming through a lot lately. You look at the last 3 games, at least 6 catches and 70 yards in every single one of those games. And in 2 of those games, he's gone over 100 yards. Now he gets a Falcons defense that's allowing the 25th most points to wide receivers. But even more importantly for Courtland Sutton, they're allowing the 6th most points to wide receivers on the outside. Also, I talked about that cover 3 with Zay Flowers. The Falcons, another team that plays cover 3 at a very high rate. Courtland Sutton, 5.18 yards per route run against cover 3, top 5 among all wide receivers. And you talked about it earlier with George Pickens. Who is he competing with targets for here? Like Devon Villay, Troy Franklin, Marvin Mims, not even a thing, not even close to a thing. The passing game runs through Courtland Sutton, and Bo Nix has been good enough. And I think in this matchup against the Falcons, he's going to be able to exploit it and take advantage of it. Probably find the end zone here. So if you're looking for that flex type of play, that wide receiver 3 with massive upside, take a look at Courtland Sutton.
I'm going to go with another line against the Jags. It's Jameson Williams that is going to get my attention this week. I know he's another one of these boom bust types. You never really know when to start him, when he'll go off. It's this week. But look, let's get beyond just the matchup. I'm not just going to blindly say, hey, start everyone against Jacksonville. But Jameson Williams specifically could thrive here. We talk about it all the time. The Jags play a ton of man coverage. Jameson Williams is great at beating man coverage. He's shown a very strong ASS this year. That's average separation score as measured by fantasy points. He is 3rd in separation score among all qualifying receivers. And the guy who's number 1 ahead of him isn't playing this year. It's Brandon Ayuk. Separation alone isn't enough. You got to get targets, right? He's getting targets. He actually had a very strong target share in his first game back from that suspension. 20% target share and 60% air yard share. And that's really where he stands out, that quality of target. He is top 20 among all wide receivers in air yard share this season, which is really amazing when you consider the fact that they got Amon-Ra St. Brown on the roster there and a good tight end in Sam Laporta. But Jameson Williams has really stood out this year, and this matchup, I almost can't keep him on the bench. Now let's get a little bit deeper. Look, these guys aren't guaranteed to smash, but if they do, you're definitely going to want to play them.
Yes, this is the I need the home run, I'm willing to risk it start of the week, and that is Quentin Johnston of the Chargers. This is a guy we know who he is. He can do absolutely nothing. He can do a little something, I guess. But this week, I think he might do a lot of something. I think he has a great matchup this week against the Cincinnati Bengals. I talk about it a lot. Quentin Johnston versus Ladd McConkey, because they're totally different wide receivers. Ladd McConkey is a guy who dominates man coverage. Quentin Johnston, a guy who dominates zone. You look at Quentin Johnston against man, his yards per route run, 1.33, but that goes all the way up to 3.09 against zone. Also, you look at Quentin Johnston, Ladd McConkey. Quentin Johnston pretty much primarily plays on the outside. Ladd McConkey primarily in the slot. The Bengals allow the third most fantasy points to outside wide receivers and just the 14th fewest fantasy points to slot wide receivers. So Quentin Johnston is actually the Chargers wide receiver that is in the better spot here. And I think this game could turn into a sneaky shootout. I know a lot of people think the Chargers defense just going to shut down the Bengals offense. I don't think it's that simple. They just gave up 2 touchdown passes to Calvin Ridley and Will Levis. I think Joe Burrow, Jamar Chase, and hey, maybe T. Higgins can put some points on the board here, and this could turn into a sneaky shootout type of game where Justin Herbert and the Chargers are throwing the ball more than they want. So yes, there is a ton of risk with Quentin Johnston. This guy always has bust potential, but if you're looking for that home run, swing for the fences type of play, he's your guy.
If I have Cedric Tillman, I think it's worth it because this is a great matchup. Probably the last really good matchup he has on what is a pretty tough schedule the rest of the season. But it is the Saints. I'm not buying that the Saints defense all of a sudden is getting better because they happened to win last week. Both Drake London and Darnell Mooney were both just a couple yards away from having 100 yards on the day. They almost gave up 200-yard games simultaneously. And the week before that, well, the Saints played the Panthers, so I'm not putting any stock into that. This defense is still not very good. Browns are going to throw the ball. They are one of the highest in terms of pass rate over expectation, and Cedric Tillman looks like he's the number one guy there. Since he got thrust into the starting lineup because Amari Cooper was traded, over the last 4 weeks, again, not including their bye week, but still, he's 4th among all wide receivers in targets per game, only behind CeeDee Lamb, Jamar Chase, and Juwan Jennings. He's getting so many targets. And again, just like I talked about earlier, with Jameson Williams, he's getting deep shots. He's getting end zone targets. This is what you want. It's a good matchup. You have to take advantage here. And it's time to pick our tight end and quarterback booms of the week. If you're looking for help, these guys might do it for you.
Yes, I'm going to give you a tight end. That's Pat Freiermuth of the Steelers. The Ravens are allowing over 6 catches per game to tight ends and 68 yards per game to tight ends. So right there, Pat Freiermuth just gives you a nice safe floor. But they're also allowing the 4th most fantasy points to pass catchers out of the slot. Pat Freiermuth runs a route out of the slot 72% of the time, which is by far the most of any tight end in the NFL. This is probably going to be another game that's going to be a lot higher scoring than people think it will be because they think the Steelers defense is going to shut down the Lamar and the Ravens. I don't think so. I think this is going to be a high scoring game. Pat Freiermuth always has a chance to score a touchdown, but I think this week he at least gives you a nice high floor as well because of this matchup against the Ravens.
And at quarterback, I could just go Russ Wilson. Let's just go all in on the Steelers, but come on, let's not pick every Steeler. That's almost too obvious anyways. I'm going to go back to that Chargers game. You talked about Quentin Johnston. I'm going to talk about Justin Herbert. And I did have Justin Herbert as my favorite streamer of the week. I like Jameis Winston, sure, but I think I feel a little bit better, more secure with Justin Herbert. Look, the Bengals are going to score points in this Chargers defense. Yes, the Chargers have a good defense, but they're not like a shut-down type of defense, and the Bengals are just rolling on offense. Plus, this game is probably going to be fast-paced because the Bengals right now have the 2nd highest pace of play among all teams. They're going to try to keep the tempo going. The Chargers might have to match them, and we've seen over the last few weeks the Chargers kind of get away from the ground game being everything of this offense and letting Herbert air it out. But here's another thing that I want to dive a little deeper into. Justin Herbert's starting to run, and not just a couple of times. He ran it 9 times last week, and in fact, since the bye that they had, he's got a scramble rate of 6.8%. That's higher than Kyler Murray and higher than Baker Mayfield, guys that you figure would run, right, to help out. Justin Herbert has become almost like a dual threat kind of guy. And remember, he scored a touchdown on the ground last week. They actually had a designed run for him. He did have that injury in the preseason, and so since the bye and since time's gone on, he must be feeling better, and they're using his athleticism. So this is another element to his game that is just going to make him more valuable in fantasy. So they're probably going to have to air it out. It's a really good matchup against a Cincinnati team that, again, allows the 4th most points to quarterbacks, so Justin Herbert could have his best game of the season. All right, now that you know who to lock in as your high upside boom picks, make sure you got your entire lineup set: quarterback, running back, wide receiver, and tight end start sit. It's all available in this week's playlist.